כל זה אחכה לו בכל יום שיבוא, ואף על פי שיתמהמה, עם כל זה אחכה לו בכל יום שיבוא, בכל יום. עם כל זה אחכה לו בכל יום שיבוא, אוי אני מאמין בכל יום. עם כל זה אחכה לו בכל יום שיבוא, אני מאמין.
Good evening. How's everybody doing? That's Shlomo Katz singing Ve'af al Pi. That's Light of the Darkness. Who's with us as we gather to do some beautiful learning on a Tuesday night? Patrice in Utah, Tom says Shalom, Jose in Miami Lakes, Pauline in Arkansas, Sharon in Lebanon, New Jersey, Guy in Dayton, Ohio, Fred in Miami Beach, Melissa in Great Neck, Nancy, North Carolina, Yehud in Florence, South Carolina, Shandora in the Bronx, Karen in Northern California, Stephen in New Hampshire, Gwen in Michigan, Paul in the Great Northwest, John in Maine, Hannah in New York, Linda Staber Pausch in Palmyra, Wisconsin. I think that's a new name. Welcome, Linda. Michael in Anderson, Indiana, another newbie. Welcome. And Doug in Connecticut. Welcome. Christo, not in Lubbock, but in Dallas. Welcome. Paula in Chicago. Nancy loves the music. Bella in Florida. Lucy, Minnesota. Travis in Ohio. Bill, I'm glad you're here. You're the sponsor. Sam in Virginia. Susie in California. And Fred says, woot, Sal speaks fast. Could I get that gig doing the side effects of medicine on commercials? I think I'm not a fast speaker, but I've gotten faster at saying the names at the top of the show. Aoife in Florida, Faith in Oregon, and Howie Weinstein with us over there on the YouTube side. Welcome, everybody. Tonight's episode of AT Daily is sponsored by our very own Bill Eldridge in honor of the recently passed humanitarian, theologian, campaigner for justice, and passionate advocate for interfaith dialogue, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who would have loved AT if he ever found out about it, and would surely want me to give to the annual campaign again to try and push it over the line. May his soul, already surely quite high in the esteem of the everlasting one, be lifted even higher, and may his prayers before the throne of the Holy One for our sakes be heard. Amen. What a beautiful dedication, Bill. And may you and all your loved ones be showered in blessings. And we say amen. Thank you for enabling us to share more Torah with more people around the world. We are holding, this is going to be page 13 of Tractate Moed Katan, the 12th volume of the Talmud. These are the laws of the intermediate days of the festivals, Passover and Sukkot. We are in chapter 2, and tonight we're going to finish chapter 2 and covering, I believe, 4 Mishnas tonight, so definitely a busy night. Generally speaking, the principle: we don't do work on the intermediate days of the holiday unless it's to avoid significant loss and it doesn't involve excessive exertion, and or it's for the needs of the public, and or it's for the needs of the festival itself. We pick this up at the bottom of 12b with Mishna number 3 here in chapter 2. A person may bring his fruit in from the field on the intermediate days of the festival because he is concerned about thieves. And he may draw his flax out of the soaking pool so that it is not ruined from soaking too long in the water, provided that he does not plan from the outset to perform his work on the intermediate days of the festival. And with regard to all of these cases, if one planned from the outset to perform his labor on the intermediate days of the festival, then the fruit of that labor must be lost and no benefit derived from it. Okay, so in terms of, saving, why wouldn't you be able to bring your fruit into the house? Because it's a little bit like excessive work, work that requires exertion, part of the harvesting produce process, etc. But to prevent a significant loss, it makes sense. Likewise, taking the flax out of the soaking pool, etc. But if you plan to do it on the intermediate days, then you blew it, right? So these are tasks that could have been done before the festival. You forgot, it didn't occur to you, you made a mistake, the fruit just happened to become ripe at that moment. Your non-Jewish business associate dumped or delivered a whole bunch of fruit unexpectedly on the intermediate days of the festival. You ordered it that it should arrive before the festival. There was a FedEx delay. It came during the festival. So now you'd rather not do all that work during the intermediate days of the festival, but to avoid the significant loss, you can deal with it as best you can to protect it. Now, as we've learned, according to Rabbi Yosef, once it becomes permitted to avoid the significant loss, then you can do whatever you would normally do with that, and that is the law. But according to Rabbi Yehuda, the minority opinion, you should do the minimum amount of work so that you don't violate this rabbinic decree to not work on the intermediate days in any unnecessary manner. Okay. The Gemara. It is taught in a Baraisa that one may bring in crops out of concern for thieves, provided that he brings them into his house discreetly. Again, funny that we're reading about this fear of thieves. I got to tell you, we live in a wonderful neighborhood here in LA. We love it. We've been here a long time. It's really gotten much more unsafe recently. It's just that there's a lot of crime. Crime is picking up in the cities. And here you have, the sages themselves. They dealt with thieves back then. They haven't mentioned violent crime. There's more violent crime. Why am I even mentioning this? My friends, we have an obligation to protect our lives and to protect the lives of our loved ones and take it seriously. Don't be casual about it. Have a burglar alarm, know where the exits are, add security cameras if you can, take whatever precautions are possible to take, in terms of possessing firearms and being trained to use them. That's a conversation for another day. I'm part of a security force, and I learned to become part of that security force. So I would say this, if you get a firearm, make sure you get a lot of training. An untrained person with a firearm is problematic. So, get trained. All right. The Gemara relates, Rav Yosef had wooden beams, which he brought into his house during the day on one of the intermediate days of the festival, during daylight. So Abaye said to him, but isn't it taught in a Baraisa? One may bring in items provided that he brings them into his house discreetly. Meaning, okay, you wanted to do this labor of bringing these expensive beams into the house so that they wouldn't be stolen or damaged. Why didn't you do it at night so you're not making this, this big spectacle during the day that people can see that you're doing work that would otherwise be prohibited? You're doing it to avoid significant loss. Okay, but you could have done it at night. And Rav Yosef said to him, discretion with respect to these beams is moving them during the day, since at night more people are required and also torch bearers would be required and the matter would be much more noticeable, right? So before you're going to rebuke your neighbor because you think he should do it a different way that would be better, maybe you better get a fuller understanding of the situation. And the Mishna states, and he may draw his flax out of the soaking pool so that it is not ruined from soaking too long in the water, provided that he does not plan from the outset to do his work on the intermediate days of the festival. And with regard to anyone, if he planned from the outset to perform his labor on the intermediate days of the festival, the fruit of that labor must be destroyed. Right? You did something that violates halacha, and so the law is you can't enjoy the benefit of that labor. Obviously, this is for a pious person. Now, Rabbi Yirmiyah asked Rabbi Zera if one planned from the outset to perform his labor on the intermediate days of the festival, so the fruit of that labor would be prohibited, but then he died after he performed that labor on the intermediate days, then what is the law? Should his children, meaning his heirs, the ones who would inherit that property, because he did work and he planned to do the work, he intentionally did prohibited work on the intermediate days of the festival. So if he's going to be a pious person, maybe he made a mistake. It's unclear to me, like if you plan to do it on that day, not knowing that that day was the intermediate day of the festival, does that mean you did it intentionally on the intermediate days of the festival? I'm going to guess that no. If you plan to do it next Tuesday, but it wasn't in your mind that that's the intermediate day of the festival, then you weren't doing it intentionally. So if you did it intentionally on that day, you would think, well, a person who's doing that, like he's not so pious that he cares. He's not going to, throw away the benefit of his labor. But maybe he became pious in the meantime. Maybe he had the awakening for some reason. And then he realizes, okay, so that the benefit of that labor is not permitted to him. But if he dies and the heirs inherit, are they going to be penalized that part of the inheritance is also prohibited to the heirs because their father intentionally did this work on the intermediate days of the festival? So now the sages analyze this question. Now, even if you might say that in the case of one who slit the ear of a firstborn animal, so the Behor, the firstborn animal of a particular female, if it's a male, if her firstborn is a male, right? So a kosher animal, a sheep, a goat, a cow, and then her firstborn is a male. So when the temple is standing, that's a Behor, and it has to be brought to the temple and offered there. If it develops a blemish, then it can't be offered on the altar, and then it becomes permitted for eating. Can you intentionally cause a blemish, which will cause it to become unsuitable to be offered in the temple, and therefore now you get the benefit of that animal. You can eat the animal. But if you intentionally cause the blemish, no, you cannot. It becomes prohibited to you. So in the case of one who slit the ear of a firstborn animal, the sages penalized his son after him. So even if this guy intentionally blemished the animal so that it couldn't be offered on the altar, he's not going to get any benefit from that because it's not permitted to him to now eat it. He dies after he caused that blemish. His son inherits that animal. Can the son now eat the animal? No, he can't. The penalty passes down to the son. However, that's different than you can't benefit from the labor if you intentionally did something that would otherwise be prohibited on the intermediate days of the festival. What's the difference? A blemished Behor, if you blemish it on purpose, you violated a written law from the Torah. If you intended to perform this prohibited work on the intermediate day of the festival, you violated a rabbinic decree. So, is the fruit of that labor, it's definitely prohibited to you, but if you die and then, those beams that are out there get passed to your son, or this animal is inherited by your son, is he penalized? In the case of the blemished Behor, no, your son can't eat it either. But we don't necessarily learn out from that the fruit of the prohibited labor on the intermediate days of the festival is also prohibited, since that's violating a rabbinic decree. And if you might say that in the case of one who sold his slave to a Gentile and then died, the sages penalized his son after him. So that's a different case. So if slavery was permitted in the ancient world. Obviously, it's distasteful, it's disgusting to us, but we're talking about in the ancient world. So then there was an interesting law that if a Jew owned a Canaanite slave, right, a slave from that local population, so while that slave who became the Jew's slave, he was not Jewish, right? And he's still not Jewish. He hasn't become a Jew by becoming the slave of a Jew, but certain mitzvahs are incumbent on him, right? And so he has very similar obligations to women. Jewish women, they're not being compared. It's not that Jewish women are like slaves. But Jewish women are excused from time-bound positive commandments, so are Canaanite slaves. But the Canaanite slave has to be circumcised, is going to eat the same foods that the owner is going to eat, is going to be obligated in lots of things that the owner is obligated in, right? So, and for that reason, once a Canaanite slave, once a Canaanite becomes the slave of a Jew, the Jew is prohibited from selling him to a non-Jew. Right, and this was actually a quite an increase in slaves' rights, as it were, compared to before that. These kinds of things existed, because if you're owned by a Jew, much better for you than if you were owned by non-Jews in the ancient world. The Jew couldn't just abuse you. The Jew had obligations towards you. You had to be fed and clothed. And you can't kill your slave. Whereas elsewhere in the ancient world, a slave was just property and, no rights whatsoever. Okay, so the Jew is not permitted to sell that non-Jewish slave to a non-Jew. And if he did, then the proceeds of that sale are not going to pass to the son. And there's other issues as well. Right, so the one who sold his slave to a Gentile and then died, so the sages penalized his son after him. And that is because every day that the slave is in the Gentile's possession precludes him from performing mitzvahs. A Canaanite slave is obligated in the same mitzvahs as a Jewish woman. If he is illegally sold to a Gentile and he escapes, requiring the seller to compensate the Gentile, the seller may not then re-enslave the slave. Once you sold him to the non-Jew, you might have to give that money back because he runs away, like there's some kind of a guarantee, and he runs away from his new owner and he comes back to you, right? So you're going to have to give the money back, and even your heir would have to give the money back to that non-Jewish purchaser. But you don't get the slave back. Because the slave was sold illegally, he's actually emancipated at that moment. And the sages extend this penalty to the owner's heirs as well. So what then is the law here, where one planned from the outset to perform his work on the intermediate days of a festival, and then after performing the work, he died? Should one say that the sages penalized the man himself, and he is no longer alive? Or perhaps the sages imposed a penalty on the money, such that no benefit may be derived from it, and it still exists in the hands of his heirs? So can the children who inherit the fruit of this prohibited labor actually keep it? So and we don't have the answer yet. Rabbi Zera said to Rabbi Yirmiyah, you already learned the answer to your question in a Mishna, Shavuot 4:2, and that's a Mishna. A field whose thorns were removed during the sabbatical year may be sown in the 8th year, as removing thorns is not a full-fledged labor that renders the field prohibited. But if that field had been improved during the sabbatical year, when you're not allowed to work the land, and somebody did work the land illegally, so he improved it with fertilizer, or he enclosed it so that animals therein would fertilize it with their manure, then it may not be sown in the 8th year. The fact that you violated the prohibitions of Shemitah, of the sabbatical year, the penalty for that is that in the 8th year, when everyone else is now planting their fields and getting back to farm work, you can't. And the sages imposed a penalty that one not benefit from prohibited labor. And Rabbi Yosef Bar Chanina said, we have a tradition that if one improved his field in a prohibited manner and then he died, his son may plant that field in the 8th year. His son may sow the field in the 8th year. The penalty does not pass to the heir. So apparently the sages penalized him, the one who did illegal work in the 7th year, but the sages did not penalize his son. And here too, with regard to work performed on the intermediate days of a festival, the sages penalized the one who did the work, but the sages did not penalize his son. Abaye said, we have a tradition that if one rendered impure another's ritually pure items, and he died before paying, The sages did not penalize his son after him and require him to pay for the damage. What is the reason for this? It is that damage that is not evident, i.e., that does not involve physical damage to the property, it's not visible to the eye, is not considered damage by Torah law. The fact that you rendered it impure and that therefore a Kohen could not eat it, for example, so it diminishes the value of that produce, but the produce still looks the same. So you do have to compensate the owner if you did that, I guess intentionally. Although it doesn't say whether it was intentional or not. Even if you did it accidentally and you're liable, you're responsible. Nevertheless, the injured party suffers a loss, and the sages penalize the one who did that action of rendering impure what was pure before. But the sages did not penalize his son. He would have to pay for the food he rendered impure, but if he died before he paid, the estate, now owned by the son, would not have to compensate the person whose produce had been rendered impure. That concludes Mishnah number 3. Mishnah number 4. One may not purchase houses, slaves, and cattle on the intermediate days of a festival unless it is for the sake of the festival, or to provide for the needs of the seller who does not have anything to eat. So houses, slaves, cattle. In the ancient world, big ticket items, right? House is obvious, but slaves and cattle, like that's like a car or a field. I mean, very big ticket items. So you shouldn't do deals like that, because even if you're going to benefit from the house, the slave, the cattle during the festival, you're going to keep benefiting from owning that thing, far into the future. So that's not something you should be doing on the intermediate days of the festival. But what does it say though? One may not purchase houses, slaves, and cattle on the intermediate days of a festival unless it is for the sake of the festival. So, okay, they're even going to let you do it if it's for the sake of the festival, but still it's something to be avoided. Or to provide for the needs of the seller who does not have anything to eat. Right, so that's something a little bit new in terms of things that are going to render work that would otherwise be prohibited, to render it permitted on the intermediate days. So we've seen, to avoid a significant loss, as long as it doesn't involve excessive exertion, to provide, for the needs of the public at large, or for the sake of the festival itself, so that you can rejoice in the festival. Here it's a little bit different. We're talking about a poor person who, if he doesn't get a job, if he doesn't get work, or if he doesn't sell something of his, that otherwise we wouldn't want to be doing that kind of buying and selling. But if we don't buy from him, he won't have money with which to enjoy the festival. So in a sense, it's one step removed, but it is for the sake of the festival. It's for his sake, so he can enjoy the festival. That's Mishnah number 4, Gemara. Rava asked Rav Nachman, what is the law with regard to wages for a worker who does not have anything to eat? Is it permitted to provide a poor worker with work on the intermediate days of the festival? Now, what are the two sides of this question? Obviously, it would be good to give this guy work so that he gets some money, so that he can then, go buy what he needs and rejoice in the festival himself or even with his family. But if you're giving him work, right, then you are hiring somebody to do labor for you, which is, surely the kind of labor that's not necessary. In this question, obviously you could do work for the sake of the festival or avoid significant loss, etc., and then you could hire somebody to do it too. But if it's work that's not permitted to you, right? Like you're going to hire this guy to do some farm work for you, that you can't do that farm work. But if he doesn't get the work, he won't have money to enjoy the festival. So is it going to be permitted in that situation? Rav Nachman said to him, we learned this in the Mishnah, or to provide for the needs of the seller if he has nothing to eat. The Mishnah we're discussing now. And what is added by mentioning the condition that he has nothing to eat? Does it not add the case of wages, and not only the case of one selling items that he owns? And Rava said to him, no, it is merely explaining what is meant by the needs of a seller. A seller is not the same as somebody who's it's not the same question. Can we sell something to him so that he has what to eat? versus can we employ him in otherwise prohibited labor so that he has what to eat? Related, but not the same. Abaye raised an objection from a Mishna. This is a Mishna we're going to come to in about 5 pages. Promissory notes may not be written on the intermediate days of a festival. So you shouldn't be, engaging in business like making loans, right? Promissory notes may not be written on the intermediate days of a festival. But if the lender does not trust the borrower and he's concerned that without such a note he will be unable to collect, or if he has nothing to eat, who has nothing to eat? I guess the one you're lending money to, or the scribe who's writing the promissory note, then he may write a promissory note. And the Gemara elaborates, what is added here by the words, if he has nothing to eat? Are they not meant to add that a promissory note may be written for the sake of the wages of the scribe who draws up the document, and conclude from it that it is permitted to hire a worker who is in need of a livelihood, even for work that would otherwise be prohibited on the intermediate days of the festival. Rav Sheshes raised an objection from a Mishnah that we covered in Tractate Pesachim on page 55 that addresses the prohibition against performing labor on the eve of Passover, right? So the 14th of Passover is when we're busy getting ready to have the Seder that night, right? When the 15th comes in. And when the temple was standing, people were especially busy because now back then, they were going to eat the Pesach, the Paschal lamb. A bunch of people would register, be part of a group that had arranged in advance that they were going to share a particular Paschal lamb. They would take it, one of their representatives would take it into the temple. It would be slaughtered there. A little portion of it would be offered up on the altar, blood sprinkled on the corners of the altar. Then he would bring it back from the temple to the campsite, as it were, and they would roast the lamb whole and eat it that night. And the whole thing had to be eaten by morning. Nothing could be left over in the morning. So there was a lot of work to do getting ready for Passover. And of course, that's still the case today in terms of work to get ready for Passover. All right. So what do we have here? How are we going to, what's going to be the connection to what we're talking about now, whether we can employ a worker or not on the intermediate days of the festival? Now we're talking about the eve of the festival. So what's going to be the connection? And the rabbis say, the practitioners of only 3 crafts are permitted to perform labor until midday on Erev Pesach, right? So it's not a Torah law. It might be a rabbinic decree. It was certainly a custom, at least in some places, to do no work on the 14th of Nisan, the day before Passover begins. But in some places, they would allow work up until noon. In the afternoon, no work, because now you're very busy with the Paschal lamb and the final preparations, etc. But at least in some places, they could work up until noon. The rabbi said people shouldn't be working even before noon unless they fall into one of 3 professions. And what are they? Tailors, barbers, and launderers, whose work is needed for the festival. And the Baraisa elaborates, the tailors may perform labor on Erev Pesach, as a layperson is permitted to sew in his usual manner during the intermediate days of the festival. So these guys can sew on the eve of the festival, at least until noon. And since similar labor is permitted during the festival, one may be lenient on Erev Pesach on the eve of Passover as well. The barbers and the launderers are permitted to work, as those who arrive from overseas or one who leaves prison are permitted to cut their hair and wash their clothes on the intermediate days of the festival. Otherwise, you shouldn't be getting haircuts or laundering your clothes on the intermediate days. But these guys can do it because they had no opportunity to do so prior to the festival. And if it enters your mind that paying wages to a worker who does not have anything to eat is permitted on the intermediate days of the festival, well, then all other types of labor should also be permitted on the eve of Passover, as there is something similar permitted on the intermediate days of the festival, namely the wages paid to a worker who does not have anything to eat. That could be in any profession, and since there are people of all professions, as long as they're poor, who are permitted to work during the intermediate days, So then all professions should also be permitted to do work up until noon on the 14th of Nisan, on Erev Pesach. Tailors are permitted to work on the eve of Passover because similar work is permitted during the intermediate days of the festival. The payment of wages to a worker who does not have anything to eat on the festival must be prohibited, as otherwise similar work, i.e. any work involving the payment of wages, would be permitted on the eve of Passover, and that is not the case. Only those three professions are permitted, and therefore it must be, now that we made this connection between the three professions that can work on Erev Pesach and who can work during the intermediate days, it must be that this contention is wrong, and we don't hire workers who are poor and would otherwise not have what to eat just to do otherwise prohibited work, just so that they should have money. That's where we got so far. Rav Papa strongly objects to this. If that is so, that one can derive laws in this manner, well, then building as well should be permitted on Erev Pesach, as a wall that tilts toward the public domain and is likely to fall and therefore endangers the public. It may be demolished and rebuilt in the usual manner on the intermediate days of the festival due to the danger posed to passers-by. Since building under such circumstances is permitted on the intermediate days of the festival, it should also be permitted on the eve of Passover. And it's not. No construction is permitted on the morning of the 14th. And Ravina also strongly objects. If that is so, your contention that this connection between Erev Pesach and the intermediate days is so strong, if that is so, a scribe who draws up documents should be permitted to do so on Erev Pesach, as one may write betrothal deeds, bills of divorce, and receipts on the intermediate days of the festival. Rather, Rav Ashi said that Rav Shesh's original objection has no basis. Are you raising a contradiction between the laws of the intermediate days of a festival and the laws of Erev Pesach? They are not comparable, as the prohibition against labor on those two periods is for a different reason. Labor is prohibited, Chol Moed, on the intermediate days of a festival because it involves excessive exertion, and in a situation of significant loss, the sages permitted it. In contrast, the prohibition on labor on the 14th of Nisan is due to the need to prepare for the festival itself, and especially the Paschal Lamb when the temple is standing. Whatever is needed for the festival, e.g. the work of tailors and barbers, that the sages permitted. But whatever is not needed for the festival, the sages did not permit it. So from the fact that only three professions are allowed to work on the morning of the 14th, according to the sages, that doesn't mean that only those three can work on the intermediate days and others can't. Different rationale, different outcome. And that concludes Mishnah number 4. And it's Gemara. Mishnah number 5, here in chapter 2. One may not move his possessions from house to house during the intermediate days of a festival, but he may move them to his courtyard if that is necessary. One may not bring home utensils from the house of a craftsman after he has completed his work, but if one is concerned about them, that if he leaves them in the craftsman's house, they are likely to be stolen, he may move them to another courtyard. Generally speaking, moving day is not going to happen in the intermediate days of the festivals. Don't get involved in moving stuff around. That's a lot of work, not in keeping with the character of the festival, even on the intermediate days. But to prevent a significant loss, maybe you need to move some stuff around. The Gemara asks, but didn't you say in the first clause of the Mishnah that one may not move one's possessions at all, even from one house to another? So how is it that the Mishnah then permits moving objects from one courtyard to another, which is a bigger move, in the second clause? And Abaye said in explanation, in the latter clause, we come to the case of moving objects from the house in his courtyard to that same courtyard. So that he's explaining, well, you can move it from your house to your garden because you have a strong reason to do that, but we don't want to go from courtyard to courtyard or from house to house. And the Mishnah states, and one may not bring home utensils from the house of a craftsman. And Rav Papa said, now, why are you bringing home utensils from the house of a craftsman? Like, why are you doing that? Why would you be doing that? The craftsman is not supposed to be working. It's his tools anyway. So why would you be bringing tools from his house to yours? Answer, maybe the craftsman borrowed money from you, and you're going to hold his tools as collateral. So that is one situation where you might have to do this, right? So one may not bring home utensils from the house of a craftsman. Rav Papa said, Rav tested us with the following question. We learned in the Mishnah that one may not bring home utensils from the house of a craftsman. And this raises a contradiction to another Mishnah. One may take utensils and bring them from the house of a craftsman, even if they are not needed for the sake of the festival. Right? So one situation is you're borrowing utensils from a craftsman because you need them for the sake of the holiday. A different one is you lent him money and you're going to borrow the tools, you're going to take the tools as collateral. Different situations. So in the Mishnah and Pesachim, one may take utensils to and from the house of a craftsman, even if they are not needed for the sake of the festival. And we answered him, here the Mishnah that permits the practice is referring to Erev Pesach, before Passover is begin, the eve of Pesach. And here the Mishnah that prohibits this is referring to the intermediate days of the festival. And if you wish, say another explanation. Both this and that refer to the intermediate days of a festival. But here where the Mishnah that prohibits the practice is referring to a case where he trusts the craftsman and he is not concerned about his utensils being lost or stolen. Maybe what was happening is the craftsman's utensil broke and you're lending him your utensil. That's another situation where this might happen. So you trust the craftsman and is not concerned about the utensils being lost or stolen. Whereas here, the Mishnah that permits taking utensils to and from the craftsman is referring to where he does not trust the craftsman. So you don't want to leave it by his house. You want to bring it back to your house so you can use it again tomorrow. And so, now we're on the B side of 13. And so it is taught in a Baraisa. One may bring home utensils from the house of a craftsman. For example, a jug from the jug maker's house, and a cup from the glass blower's house, as they will be used on the festival itself. So here's another idea. You're borrowing the utensils so that you can use them to enjoy the festival, right? That's why you would borrow a jug from the jug maker's house and a cup from the glass blower's house. Why does it matter that you're borrowing these utensils from the craftsman? Because just to borrow a cup so that you can use it for the festival seems fine. But now that you're borrowing it from a professional, right, who shouldn't be touching those things at all, for him there may be muktzah, right, the ones that are his actual inventory of things that he sells. So that's a different situation, borrowing that. Right? So you see, once you get a little deeper into the cases, you can see how the nuances kick in. And so it is taught in Baraisa, one may bring home utensils from the house of a craftsman, the jug from the jug maker's house, and the cup from the glass blower's house. But he may not bring home wool from the dyer's house or utensils from the craftsman's house, as they won't be used during the festival. Tools or unfinished material that is not yet ready to be used and enjoyed on the festival. But if the craftsman has nothing to eat, so then he may give him his wages during the festival week and leave the utensil with him. Maybe you're going to purchase something. You don't need it during the festival, but he needs the money. So whereas normally you wouldn't be engaged in this kind of buying and selling for something you don't need during the festival. Now pay him so he has money to buy what to enjoy with on the festival. Don't take home the product. You could take it home after the festival. Unless you don't trust him that this thing that you purchased and then left with him, something's going to happen to it, then you could bring it home. And if he does not trust the craftsman to properly safeguard the utensil that he's purchased from him, he may take the utensil from the craftsman and leave it in a house near him. And if he is concerned about his utensils lest they be stolen, he may move them to another courtyard. And if he does not trust the owner of the other courtyard, he may bring them into his house discreetly. Right? Do it at night. Do it in a discreet manner so that people don't look at you and it looks like you're buying and selling during the festival when it's not for your own needs and it's something you shouldn't be doing and it looks like you're flagrantly violating the spirit of the festival, so you do it discreetly. You're doing it to benefit this guy so he can enjoy the festival but be discreet about it. And the Gemara comments, you have adequately explained the contradiction between the Mishnayos about whether one may bring home utensils from the house of a craftsman. The Mishnah that permits it can be understood as referring to a case where the craftsman is not to be trusted. But the Mishnah in Pesachim also states that one may take utensils to the house of a craftsman, and this is difficult. As the Mishnah above teaches, one may not bring home utensils from the house of a craftsman. And this indicates that all the more so one may not take utensils from his house to the craftsman. Rather, it is clear, as we answered initially, that one Mishnah is referring to Erev Pesach, the laws about, on the eve of Passover when you want to be busy preparing for the festival, and the other Mishnah is talking about the intermediate days of the festival. And that concludes the Gemaras of Mishnah number 5. Mishnah number 6, the last Mishnah here in chapter 2. On the intermediate days of a festival, figs that were spread out to dry may be covered with straw to protect them from rain and dew and to protect you from significant loss. Rabbi Yehuda says one may even condense the figs. Those who sell produce, clothing, and utensils may sell them in private for the sake of the festival. Don't get involved in big market activity, but to help others enjoy the festival, to help you enjoy the festival, you can do this buying and selling quietly. Fishermen and groats makers and bean pounders who pulverize the beans may ply their trades in private for the sake of the festival. Rabbi Yosei says they were stringent with themselves to refrain from this work, even with respect to what was needed for the festival. Gemara. Rabbi Chiya bar Abba and Rabbi Asi disagree about the following issue. And both of them assert their opinions in the name of Chizkiah and Rabbi Yochanan. That's right? So they're going to actually disagree about something, but they're both citing the same source. How does it work? One said, cover the figs means to lightly cover them with straw, and condense means to spread straw over them densely. And the other one said, cover means to spread straw over them, whether lightly or densely, and condense means to amass the figs into a pile, making it as if it were a pile of grain. And this is also taught in a Baraisa. One may condense, i.e. amass the figs into a pile, making it as if it were a pile of grain. And this is the statement of Rabbi Yehuda. So the Mishnah states, on the intermediate days of a festival, those who sell produce, clothing, and utensils may sell them in private for the sake of the festival. Fishermen, groats makers, right? Groats is husked grains. Groats makers and bean pounders may ply their trade in private for the sake of the festival. Right? These are people who make a living preparing produce, moving the produce process along. And people are going to need that produce so that they can eat it and rejoice in the festival. So the one who is doing that kind of work, is he going to engage in his normal workday labor that he does all year during the intermediate days of the festival? The product of his labor is something that others need to rejoice in the festival. The money that he gets for doing that labor might help him enjoy the festival. But he's still doing his regular work on the intermediate days of the festival. And some people who are engaged in these lines of work didn't do it because they wanted to enjoy the festival. Even though others might have needed that, hey, they could have, engaged me to do that labor before the festival. The Mishnah states, on the intermediate days of a festival, those who sell produce, clothing, and utensils may sell them in private for the sake of the festival. Fishermen, groats makers, and bean pounders may ply their trades in private for the sake of the festival. Rabbi Yosei says that they were stringent with themselves. And the sages asked, well, when it says that they were stringent with themselves, does it mean that they did not work at all on the intermediate days of a festival? Or perhaps it means that they were discreet and made the deals and the selling and get the wages for their labor in private. And the Gemara answers, based on a Baraisa, come in here, those who sell produce, clothing, and utensils may sell them in private for the sake of the festival. And Rabbi Yosei says the merchants of Tiberias were stringent with themselves not to sell at all, even in private. Hunters of animals, fowlers, and fishermen may hunt their quarry discreetly for the sake of the festival. What's wrong with that sentence when you hear it, right? Hunters. What's the problem with Jewish hunters? You can't go hunting. A deer is a kosher animal, right? So you can eat deer meat. Venison is a kosher meat. Can you go out and shoot a deer in the wild? Can you go out and shoot it with an arrow and then eat it? It's a kosher animal. Answer, no, you cannot, because it was not shechted, right? For a kosher animal to produce kosher meat, it has to be slaughtered by a kosher shochet, right? So it's the kosher way of slaughtering the animal, which has many, many particular requirements, but is basically slitting the neck and letting all the lifeblood drain out of the animal quickly. So what does it mean that hunters are permitted to hunt? So it could mean two things. One is that they trap the animal in a way that doesn't hurt the animal, because if it's hurt, it can become a treifa. But trap the animal in a way that doesn't hurt it, and then bring it to the shochet who slaughters it properly. So that's a trapper. Or there's a note here that the word hunter in this context is actually referring to fishermen. Right? So fishermen you can go fishing. So hunters of animals, fowlers, who I guess are trapping birds, because same issue with the birds, and fishermen may hunt their quarry discreetly for the sake of the festival, right? So you can bring animals that people are going to eat on the festival, during the festival. Rabbi Yosei says, the hunters of Akko, the fishermen, right? Akko is a coastal city. So it really means the fishermen, were stringent with themselves not to hunt at all. Groats makers who crack grain into groats called chilka, targis, and tisane crack the grain in private for the sake of the festival. And Rabbi Yosei says the groats makers of Tzipori were stringent with themselves not to crack grain at all. The product of their labor is permitted and it helps other people rejoice on the festival, but they didn't want to do their normal workaday work during the intermediate days, so they didn't engage in it. According to Rabbi Yosef, the stringencies, when they say that these people were stringent with themselves, it means they refrained from the work entirely. It's getting a little late, so I'm going to skip the next, 3-4 sentences where they have a little bit of a debate of what is the definition of the various kinds of groats that were being made. Basically, when they crack the grain and husked it, did they crack it into 2 pieces, 3 pieces, or 4 pieces? That's the basic difference between chilka, targis, and tisane. So now we pick it up with the end of chapter 2. The Gemara relates that Rav Huna permitted the spice merchants, kerufayata, to go and sell their products in their usual manner in the marketplace on the intermediate days of a festival. And Rav Kahana raised an objection to Rav Huna's ruling from a baraisa. If a store opens into a row of pillars that runs along the street, a colonnade, the storekeeper may open and close it in his usual manner on the intermediate days of a festival, since it is not in the public's view. Right? He's got a store. It's not way out in public so that everyone can see, hey, this guy's open for business on the intermediate days. So if your store is in a more discreet location, you can be open, just selling things that people need to use on the festival. And spice merchants, for sure, spices get used on the festival. However, if your store opens to the public domain, you got a great location, great storefront, lots of foot traffic, that is problematic on the intermediate days of the festival. If it's open to the public domain, he may open only one door and must close the other. You can open your business, but you have to do so in such a way that people get that you're only open for the needs of the festival. If you have 2 doors that normally are open, you only open one of them. You signal to the public that you get it's the intermediate days and you're just doing business for the sake of the intermediate days. And on the eve of the last day of the festival of Sukkot, he may take out his wares from the store and adorn the markets of the city with fruit in honor of the last day of the festival. Right? So on Hoshana Rabbah, the last of the intermediate days before we get into final days of Sukkot. Not only do they allow the buying and selling in an indiscreet manner, they encourage it. They wanted the marketplaces filled with produce and spices and people coming and going as a kavod, as an honor to the final festival day, and that people are going to really celebrate on it. In honor of the last day of the festival. And the Gemara infers, for the honor of the last day of the festival, yes, it is permitted for him to open the store in order to give people the opportunity to prepare for the holiday. But when not for the honor of the festival, i.e. during the other intermediate days of the festival, he is not permitted to do so. How then did Rav Huna permit those spice merchants to sell as usual on the intermediate days of the festival? La Kashya, this is not difficult. The Baraisa that prohibits selling in the usual manner is referring to the sale of fruit, which is usually bought in large quantities and could have been purchased before the festival. People might therefore suspect the buyer of purchasing it for use after the festival. In contrast, this lenient ruling of Rav Huna is referring to the sale of spices, which is permitted because people buy them only in small quantities for the sake of the festival, and the coming and going is going to be discreet anyway. That concludes chapter 2. We'll pick it up tomorrow, God willing, with chapter 3 at the bottom of page 13. Let's see if we've got any questions. Here we go. Tom, but what of a slave who originally sold himself into slavery because he was indigent? Emancipating him might not solve his financial predicament. Okay, so that's a different situation, right? So first of all, you see there's a distinction under Torah law in terms of a Jew owning a slave. He's the one that is bound by Torah law and has obligations toward his slave. So there's definitely going to be a difference between owning a Jewish slave and owning a Canaanite slave. The Jewish slave is going to go free as a matter of course at the end of 6 years, I think. The Canaanite slave, you're not permitted to emancipate him, right? He is going to be inherited by the heirs like real estate, like real property. Unless you sell him to a non-Jew, then that would trigger this rabbinically created emancipation. So did he sell himself into slavery to pay off a debt? That would be when the Jew becomes a slave of another Jew and he becomes an indentured servant basically to work off the debt. And then the Torah also says, and when he goes free, he doesn't go empty-handed. You actually have to give him what to set himself up in his new life. In terms of the Canaanite slave, emancipating him in that situation might not solve his predicament. But the fact that he, worked for you all that time, maybe he learned a trade, maybe he's going to be able to get set in a new way. But it's an interesting point, Tom. Good job. Bill, I think the sages are justly more concerned with the malpractice of the slave owner. Considered if he was indigent, he could go and sell himself to another master, one who would keep the Torah's commandments instead of trying to sell him out to a Gentile and thereby gain for himself better working conditions. So I think, Bill, you're answering Tom's question. Thank you. And Sharon, judging by Peah and Shemitah. So Peah is the Torah obligation to leave the corners of the field. You don't harvest the corners of your field so that poor people can come by, and harvest it themselves for their own use, right? It's a form of charity. And by the way, that's where we get payas, right? Like a certain Hasidic sects, like Breslovers, they have the long payas, the side locks. That's the same word, right? Because they're letting the corner of their scalp grow long. They don't cut that as a sign of piety, right? So judging by Peah and Shemitah, the sabbatical land cycle, I sense that for dignity of the one in need, food handouts are not the primary way to get food to the hungry poor. Exactly. It would be better to pay them wages so that they can get the money in a dignified way. And also that great idea of better than giving a man a fish is to give him a fishing pole so that he can provide for himself in a more dignified manner. Yosef, just throwing out this question as a curiosity, I wonder what form of policing they had in the ancient world, both in the Second Temple era and the Talmudic time as well. It's a really good question. Once you get to the Second Temple period, and First Temple period too, as opposed to earlier than that, right? So before you had a king, before King Saul was the first king, so then you had the time of the judges, right? And there was a lot more kind of, local policing, let's say, local officials. There were judges, but they weren't the same as kings. There were prophets, but they weren't the same as kings. Once you had a king, now you had a more centralized central government charged with maintaining the king's peace, as it were. Once you get to the Second Temple period, now you have a local governor who's ruling on behalf of a foreign emperor. Whether that's the Persian Empire or the Greek Empire or the Roman Empire, you have local governors, and they're enforcing the peace. When you're talking about a Sanhedrin enforcing Torah laws, so that's a little bit different than just enforcing the peace. And they don't have prison, right? They don't have prison. The sages don't have prison. That's not one of the penalties that they can enforce. They have financial penalties, they have flogging, and they have the death penalty. But a court that issued a death penalty, more than once in 70 years was considered a murderous court, right? So it's really a lot more in terms of, a Beis Din, a rabbinic court. It's going to be much more about assessing damages in the realm of civil lawsuits, more so than crime and theft. Probably Bill could give a better answer than I could. He's very historically astute about what kinds of, I imagine, I don't know if they were called police or if it was more detachments of the army that were preserving the peace. When you talk about the Pax Romana, right, enforcing the peace, maybe that refers more to, keeping a peace as opposed to war, rather than, the peace of the streets, keeping, murderers and robbers at bay. But, somebody who knows more about this than I do, I'd be happy to hear more about what policing was like in those periods. Okay, my friends, that's what I've got for us today. With God's help, we'll open chapter 3 here in Tractate Moed Katan tomorrow, Wednesday. Have a great night.